Hi, I'm Ellen from the Chili Dog. If you have ever knit a seamless sweater from the top down, you know that they are naturally prone to noticeable holes on either side of the underarm stitches where the body is transitioning down into the sleeves. This issue is generally not specifically addressed in knitting patterns. So today, as I'm starting on the sleeves of my Cereus sweater, I'd like to share how I approach this weird gap. First, we'll take a close look at the underarm to identify landmarks that can be used to locate this little problem gap. Then I'll share a couple options for picking up stitches in relation to those landmarks. Finally, I'll show you how to decrease those added stitches to minimize and not enhance any possible holes. For demonstration purposes, I'll be spreading out my fabric quite a bit so it's easier to show you what's happening. When you are actually working on your own sweater, you want to be very gentle in these gap areas so that you don't stress the fabric any more than absolutely necessary. Let's get started. Before you actually start knitting the sleeve, it can be helpful to locate a couple landmarks. Right now, the sleeve stitches from my yoke are still being held on a piece of waste yarn. I used a provisional cast on to make the underarm stitches, so they are actually also being held on this same piece of waste yarn. Depending on your pattern and how you cast on the underarm stitches when you divided the body and the sleeve, it's entirely possible that you may need to pick up stitches along the edge of the underarm when you start knitting your sleeve. However, you'll still be looking for the same landmarks in these two underarm gaps. Let's turn and zoom in a bit so we can look for those landmarks. What you're looking for is a single strand of yarn that's coming from the underarm side. It goes through one single stitch right there, and then it comes out near the held sleeve stitches. The same is going to be true on the gap on the other side of the underarm. You're looking for the same sort of landmark. You're looking for one strand of yarn that's coming from the underarm side. It goes through one single stitch and then comes out near the held sleeve stitches. Once you've located these landmarks, you can use them to show you where to pick up or increase 2 stitches in the gaps between the underarm and the held sleeve stitches. Like so many things in knitting, there's no one single right or best way to pick up stitches in this gap. So you'll need to think about what's going to work best for your situation. If you pick up the pair of gap stitches under each side of this landmark strand, it's comparable to creating a pair of make one increases. One make one right and one make one left. The make ones essentially twist each side of the lifted strand shut in opposite directions when you increase your 2 stitches. Which looks neater? A make one right followed by a make one left, or a make one left followed by a make one right, may depend on your particular stitch pattern. Just make sure to be consistent. So if at the first gap you use a make one right and then a make one left, and then you knit around your sleeve stitches, when you get to the second gap, do the same thing. Start with a make one right followed by a make one left, and then continue to the underarm stitches. Another option is to treat your picked up gap stitches more like they're either lifted increases or median increases. This is easier to identify on the knit side of stockinette, so I have turned my sweater inside out. You're looking for the same landmark in the gap. It's that strand of yarn that runs from the underarm stitches through a single gap stitch and then out the other side towards your sleeve stitches. We don't want to pick up stitches in any of these 3 spaces. Instead, we'll pick up 2 stitches, 1 on each side of the gap, and we want to make sure that our picked up stitch comes through a stitch that's adjacent to 2 spaces. So we'll start on the right hand side of the gap. I'm going to spread things out a little bit, and this stitch right here is adjacent to both this space and this space. I can treat my picked up stitch like a median increase and insert my needle through that stitch and also go under that landmark strand and pull a new stitch back through. Or I can just go under the leg of that stitch that's closest to the sleeve opening, but over anything else, and then pull the stitch back through. Whichever way you choose to use, make sure that you're consistent and do it throughout as you're picking up these gap stitches. On the left-hand side of the gap, again, I'm looking for a stitch that's adjacent to these 2 spaces. This one's a little bit easier to see. It's right here. And again, my choices are either I'm going to go through like a median increase and just go all the way through the stitch, and that landmark will also be over my knitting needle, and then I would pull the stitch, a new stitch back through, or like a lifted increase where you're just going under just that one leg of the stitch, but over everything else, and then pull the stitch back through. After adding your 2 new stitches in the gaps, you'll need to decrease those extra stitches so that you can return to your original stitch count. Sometimes this is best done in the same round where you make the increases. Sometimes it's better to wait until the next round. You'll need to decide which option makes more sense for you. Either way, when you're decreasing, you don't want to stress the fabric by pulling those increased gap stitches away from the center of the gap, because it will increase your likelihood of creating a visible hole, which is exactly what we're trying to avoid. Instead, it's better to slant your stable stitches from the underarm and from the sleeve towards the center of the gap to close things up. The most memorable way to do this is to pass these outer stitches over the inner gap stitches. So on the first side of the gap, it would be similar to working a slip knit pass or a slip purl pass. So you would slip the first stitch knitwise, and this stitch could be coming from the underarm or from the sleeve, depending on which side of the sweater you're on. You would work the next stitch, and by working it, you may either knit or purl into it, or it may be where you're picking up that stitch in the gap, and then pass the first stitch over the top of the second stitch. On the other side of the gap, you'll either want to pick up your gap stitch or work the stitch that you picked up. Once you work it, you'll actually return it to your left hand needle without twisting it, and then pass the stable stitch from either the sleeve or the underarm up over the top of the gap stitch, and then slip the gap stitch back to the right hand needle. One very important final note. After you've increased, then decreased those gap stitches in the first round or two of the sleeve, be gentle with your fabric. You'll likely be very anxious to see if your gap closing worked properly, but tugging at the fabric before you can stabilize the sleeves by knitting a few more rounds can cause unexpected problems. So be patient before you start pulling and poking around the gaps. I hope you enjoyed learning how to mind the gaps when you're working top-down sweater sleeves. If you did, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends. If you'd like to try these techniques in a pattern, head over to the shop section of thechillydog.com and look for my Cereus sweater. Until we stitch again, happy knitting!